Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be in a room like this with so many people who are dedicated to making sure that elections work. Elections being they're not the only thing you need to have a democracy, but they're clearly one of the fundamental pieces of it. I'll say more about that in a second, but let me begin by describing where we are, because I think right now the democratic world is under an unprecedented degree of challenge. It's not just our internal challenges, it's not just the normal challenges of democracy. Democracies have always been difficult. You've always had divisions, you've always had fractiousness. It's always been a difficult system, famously difficult system to maintain. That's why the writers of our Constitution, actually, of the American Constitution, built so many checks and balances into their system and made it so complicated. I know you're going to hear about that in the next session, so I won't talk about it. But we're also at an unusual moment internationally, and I think this audience is in a really good position to appreciate that. We are now facing something, I think, as democracies that is new. Namely a network of dictatorships, a network of autocracies. I've described them in a recent book that I think you've been given in your packet of information. I've used the expression autocracy Inc. because it's a network of countries who are not united by ideology. So we're talking about communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, countries as disparate and varied as North Korea or Venezuela or Belarus, who have nevertheless begun to work together and to cooperate around their own drive for power, but also to cooperate in pushing back against democracy. And so these are the one thing that these states all do have in common is that they're all run by either individual leaders or by ruling parties who seek to rule without checks and balances, without real opposition, maybe with elections, but with manipulated fake elections, without a free press, without an independent judiciary. And they've come to understand those ideas, the idea of press freedom, the idea of rights, the idea of the rule of law. They've come to understand those ideas as a challenge to them and their form of power. And therefore they push back on them both inside their own countries, whether it's the attempt to crush anti-corruption movements like the Navalny movement in Russia, or rights movements like the women's movement in Iran. And they seek to crush them at home, but increasingly they also push back against democracy around the world. Some of this you can see in the news. I don't have to tell you that there are North Korean troops in Russia, that there's military cooperation between Russia and Iran, that the Chinese have deep links to North Korea. Some of it we see in the news, we see it every day. Some of it is economic. The quasi-state, quasi-private companies in one country will invest in the quasi-state, quasi-private companies in another. So you'll have oddities like Iranian investment in Venezuela, which is designed to both to profit from both to make profits on both sides, but also it's an Iranian attempt to prop up a very, very unpopular Venezuelan regime, which actually just lost an election and yet is nevertheless clinging to power. But there is also an information, or you could even just call it propaganda piece of this too, which I think is very relevant to this audience. There is now a group of autocratic states who don't necessarily, this is not a coordinated project, but who in opportunistic ways sometimes work together to undermine the idea of democracy itself. So to build a narrative, autocracies are stable and safe. Democracies are weak and divided. The autocratic world can protect you and your family and offer you security. The democratic world promotes war or promotes chaos or promotes division. And the language of that narrative, you can hear it, again, inside the autocratic world. It's the primary message from Russian state media. You can also hear it from Chinese state media. It's the message that many of those countries project in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. But it's also increasingly language that they use and that is adopted by enemies of democracy or people inside the democratic world who also hope to use that language of chaos as a way of either winning elections and eventually taking power. So talking about democracy as catastrophic, as a failure, as a disaster, undermining people's faith in the system, convincing people that elections are unfair, that there's cheating, a problem made especially difficult in places where there is cheating, which of course happens in some parts of the world. And you can see it in the form of whether it's the Russian state media paying influencers in the United States who promote this kind of language, or whether it's the Chinese promoting that kind of language in Taiwan. There are versions of it in almost every democracy in the world. Some of it comes from the autocratic states themselves, and some of it, of course, is internal. You don't need to have Russian money or Chinese bots in order to use that narrative yourself. If you're somebody who has aims at, who seeks to undermine your own political system or create doubt about it as a path to gain power or to change the system. And we see it really in almost every country. I mean, we have it in the United States, we have it in most European countries, we have it all over the world. And what I wanted to close by saying is that we've all learned, I think, in the last few years that merely fact-checking lies or merely putting out a statement saying that such and such a rumor is not true is now insufficient to stop the rumor. Conspiracy theories, we've constructed an information system in which conspiracy theories move faster around the world than real news does. Real news is very often suppressed now. It's suppressed on Twitter. It's suppressed by the Meta network, by Facebook and Instagram. Journalism is failing for all kinds of reasons, or is being undermined for all kinds of reasons, some financial, but also from the influence of the platforms. And that makes it harder and harder to get real information out to people. And what I wanted to say here today, and really the primary reason why I wanted to come and speak to you, is that I do think that election workers and people who are involved in monitoring and running and staffing elections are some of the people who can resist this. Not merely by putting out the occasional statement yourselves, but by creating campaigns around what you do, by conducting information campaigns about what it is that you do, how elections work, how they're run. I mean, you can see a lot of that happening in the United States right now. Maybe some later speakers will speak about it. Maybe in your trips around the U.S. and doing election monitoring, you can speak to people about it. There are now projects that bring together election officials and law enforcement so that these are two different worlds, but so that they understand each other, so that if there are attempts to undermine the election either on the day or on the day after when votes are being counted, that both sides understand how they can work together. There are media campaigns. I'm on the mailing list of the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, who's a Republican, who, in his state, he's in charge of his elections, and he puts out almost daily bulletins, and he has a daily presence on social media where he talks about the challenges to Georgia and what he's doing to overcome them. So we see, proactive election officials going out. It's not enough anymore to wait for someone to accuse you of cheating. You actually have to go out and make yourself a figure. You have to become a figure of trust. You have to create trust around your institution. And that's one of the ways. I mean, there's a much longer conversation to be had about how to push back against the autocratic wave and the autocratic narrative. But you as election workers and officials and observers have a special role in thinking about that. A little bit of ordinary PR is no longer enough. It's now about building trust, seeking links to community leaders, talking in public, having a public face, learning how to speak to, as I said, other institutions in the community who work with you, whether it's the police or whether it's political leaders, whether it's other kinds of business or church or religious leaders, you actually now have to be the face of honest and trustworthy elections, because actually elections can be a source of stability. I mean, if you think about it, this is what democracies have that other systems don't have, and we have a lot of flaws. But one of the things we have is that we have a legitimate, fair way, an agreed upon way to change power, to hand over power, which is guaranteed or is supposed to be peaceful. And this is something that we can offer our communities. We can say, periodically power needs to change in whatever political system you live in, and we are the means by which it happens without violence, without bloodshed, and without real division and civil war. And so being proud of what you do, but also understanding that you have a bigger responsibility, that you're not just a bureaucrat counting votes, you're not just somebody on the sidelines. You have a central role now in countering the autocratic narrative inside your own country and then being part of the democratic narrative around the world. So I'll just close with those notes. Thank you very much for being here. Enjoy learning about our weird electoral system if you don't know about it already. It was designed in the 18th century. That's, I think, the only excuse I have for it. It was an era before there was such a thing as popular democracy in a real sense. And the people who designed the U.S. Constitution were very worried about whether it would last. It did last, at least until now. I mean, we don't know what will happen next week, but it did last, and so there is some value to it. There's some worth in learning about it. So enjoy your time in the United States, or if you're American, enjoy hosting your guests and have a great meeting. Thank you.